I'll give people a moment to start to come in. The numbers tick up slowly but surely. Okay. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. Very happy to be back with you today for the first of our June book talks. I was realizing tonight it's been a little while and I've missed gathering with everybody, so really happy to be back together. Please say hello in the chat box. Make sure to chat to everyone. We love to know who is with us in the room. And also the chat box is where you can add your questions throughout the program, and I will try to bring them into our conversation. A few words about JWA for anybody who's new to us. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way that we understand history and Jewish culture through documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We also pay special attention to how gender functions in the past and present. And we do all of this because we believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world, which feels deeply important right now and always. So thank you for being with us. The book talks are just one piece of what we do. I hope that you will check out jwa.org to explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer and really delve into the archive. It's fun and hopeful, and there's lots to discover there. A very quick logistical note. If you would like captioning, you can click the button at the bottom of your screen that says CC or show captions. That should turn them on for you. We can't turn them on for you, but that should work. I am so delighted to introduce our featured author for this evening. Mimi Zieman is a writer, a physician, and a speaker with a new memoir that we're going to be talking about tonight, Tap Dancing on Everest, about the risks we take to become our truest selves. Mimi has also written a play, The Post-Row Monologues, that's been performed in multiple cities, as well as a medical guide, Managing Contraception, and her writing has appeared in many publications, including Newsweek, Salon, Ms. Magazine, The Forward, NBC News, and many other publications. She did her OBGYN training at Columbia and is an advocate for reproductive rights. She served as Director of Family Planning at Emory University School of Medicine, the Chief Medical Officer of Planned Parenthood of the Southeast, and as an advisor to the CDC working on contraceptive guidelines. She serves on the boards of JWA and NCJW in Atlanta, who honored her with the Women Who Dared Award. And Mimi, we're so delighted to have you here with us tonight. Welcome.
Thank you, Judith. I'm really so delighted to be with you. And I thank everybody who's here tonight. And it's an honor and a privilege to speak with you.
Well, I was so excited to read your book and really enjoyed it. And I recommend it for everybody on with us tonight who hasn't read it yet, that you'll all get a taste of it. But this is a book that is about an experience at the center that you had more than 35 years ago when you were a doctor for a team attempting to summit Mount Everest while you were still in medical school. And you've written it obviously after the fact. So how did you come back to this story and why now?
Yeah, well, when I came back from the mountain at 25, I wanted to write about our incredible experience, but I came back to fourth year of medical school and then OBGYN training, and there was just no way to do that. And after that, some of the climbers wrote books that were just fantastic and didn't really feel the need at the time anymore to write it. And then very recently, sort of suddenly started writing the book. I didn't even know I still wanted to. And it became clear to me that I really wanted to tell the woman's story. I was the only woman on the team. A doctor on Everest story, there aren't many. And there was no woman doctor on Everest book that I could find. And also just a different perspective on a mountaineering expedition, because it usually is the climber story. And I wanted to tell what it was like for what I describe as a more ordinary person in this extraordinary experience. And our team, it ended up being that our Everest climb is in the history books. It was a very unique climb. So I felt like I wanted to add my perspective to it, even though it's so long ago. Of course, the book that I wanted to write now then became completely different than something I would have written when I was younger, because now what was interesting to me was how the hell did I end up on that mountain? I was born in New York City, daughter of Jewish immigrants who literally came off the ship. My father was the only Holocaust survivor in his family. I was raised in an Orthodox community. So now the questions to me weren't only about telling this incredible adventure, but how did that happen? What choices did I make in life? How did I end up on that mountain? Which now feels like at a young age, with that big responsibility. So it just sort of came out of me.
Can you uh, read a little bit just to give us a taste?
Yeah, I'll read from the beginning of the book. It does have different parts with different epigraphs at the beginning of each part. So part one is called Searching, and it has a little quote by Pema Chodron, which gives you a taste of the theme of the book. If we go to the places that scare us, we just might find the boundless life we've always dreamed of. And then the first chapter is called At Risk. It's May 1988, Kangshung Glacier, Tibet. We peered into the white snow, white clouds, white nothingness. The east face of Everest, where our route snaked through gullies, crevasses, and overhanging ice pinnacles, rose 2 miles into the Tibetan sky above. Our small team of 6 had 4 climbers, a photographer, and me, a 25-year-old medical student. The climbers were attempting a new route. They were purists, nimble, using no oxygen or Sherpa support. Joe, our photographer, sat on a blue barrel at Advanced Base Camp and searched through our telescope for the dark outlines of 3 climbers missing on the mountain. His eyes, finely tuned to details and shapes, shadows and forms, focused on the white slope. We'd last spotted the climbers days earlier, tiny dots ascending toward the summit, creeping over the edge of our route onto the South Col, the link between Tibet and Nepal, east and south, visible and invisible. We distinguished them by the color of their coats and hats, steadily inching up in the bright sunshine. Now there was no sun, just lackluster white, and our world of waiting felt like groping through darkness, except that everything was flat and stark and still. The tarp of our yellow tent flapped overhead, the wind electric with panic. I stretched out on my belly to Joe's right, propped up on my elbows and rubbed my dry eyes, willing our friends into view as if desire were a magnet. My teeth chattered and elbows burned from the pebbles dimpling them, so I piled sleeping bags over and under me. Our team's 4th climber, Paul, who'd been forced off the mountain days earlier due to altitude sickness, stood to Joe's left just outside the tent. The 3 of us were on our own route, a route of waiting, tethered as if by climbing ropes. The landscape offered nothing, no tracks in the snow, no blasts of light from their headlamps, 2 flashes for safe, 6 for SOS. With no sign of them by dusk, my hopes for their return dwindled. They were in the death zone, an extreme elevation above 26,000 feet, where oxygen is a fraction of that at sea level, where muscles lag with lethargy, where the brain hungers for oxygen and thoughts stall and sink in a slush of gray matter, where the body rapidly decays and eventually stops functioning. No climber had ever survived more than 3 days in the death zone without supplemental oxygen. We were nearing the end of day 6.
Hmm. One of the things that I love about the book is that it's got a lot of different stories all in one, and you can tell from even from that little bit, that it's a suspenseful adventure tale and it's a coming of age story. It's a story of the impact of, family history. It's about the relationships between human and nature. I'm curious if there was kind of one piece that was the starting place for you and whether you were surprised by any of the other elements that kind of emerged as you were writing the story.
I think I was surprised by everything that emerged because, like I said, I started writing one day. I didn't know it would all come out of me. I had very extensive journals. So a few years earlier, I had transcribed my Everest journal. Um, but then that first day that I went to tell this adventure story that had been like percolating for 30 years, um, all this family stuff came out on the page. And I had never in my life like wanted to write about my family history. And I had to just let the writing process happen and see what that was all about. And so it really took a long time to realize it was a coming of age story and that I wanted to connect the dots, and I wanted to explore the choices we make as we form our identities and what goes into that, like you said, our family, our own, inviolable voice. For me, many of the decisions ended up being um, just a really internal curiosity that drove me in certain directions.
I had only, I think, ever read one Everest story before, Into Thin Air. And part of what I loved about your book is exactly what you said, which is this is the story of a kind of ordinary person, and there's a lot of waiting, and there's a lot of, sort of like, how did I even get here? Um, so tell us a little bit about how you actually got there. I mean, you've said that you grew up in New York as a daughter of immigrants, and you write in the book that Everest was not on your list of shoulds, and it was definitely an unexpected path. So give us a little sense of the how you arrive at that moment.
Yeah, so I trace it, and I use this. I use several metaphors, recurring metaphors throughout the book. But one is that I imagine, when I look back at how I got there, I imagine it like a hiking trail. Those are on a map with dashed lines. So I imagine those dashed lines and the spaces in between them as moments where I pause to figure out which way to go. And often the choices I made were, again, just these curiosities. So, and the very random things. So, for example, I went to college in Montreal, and I'm walking through the biology department. I see a poster of the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. And the next thing you know, I'm there, and I fall in love with the mountains. And some random things happen there. I went for 2 summers. The second summer, I happened to watch a slideshow that a researcher was giving on acid rain in Tibet. And I was sitting there, and all of a sudden I knew I was going to go there. Like, it was just this voice inside that said, I have to go to those mountains. And that next year I applied to medical school and planned my trip. Now, Tibet was closed at the time. So I decided to hike in Nepal alone. I was 22 at the time, still living in New York City, a city girl. Um, Put on a backpack that wasn't even a real, I didn't have money for a backpack. I borrowed a backpack that was a suitcase that happened to have straps on it and ended up in the Himalayas. And one thing led to another. I hiked for a few months. This was before I started medical school. I met Everest climbers during that trip and was later invited to join their next expedition.
There's this
Then I have to battle a lot of fears and insecurities and vulnerabilities to decide to take on that big role while still a medical student.
right. And there's such an interesting balance in your story and in the book around um, the sense of just how unexpected and random some things are, but also feeling called to it. So there's both this sense of like, this is where I deeply belong, and also, oh my God, how did I end up here? And there's this one passage that I love where you use the framework of Dayenu and say, like, you sort of trace all the things that needed to happen that could have gone another way. You could have gone to a different school. You could have not seen that poster for the place in the Rocky Mountains. You could have not seen that slideshow, sort of that sense of gratitude of like, all of these things needed to happen in order for me to arrive at that point. And I could very much relate to that sense of like gratitude for something that's happened, and also almost like fear that, oh my God, it could have not happened. I could have not leapt into the thing that I felt drawn towards.
Exactly. It feels so random and then so preordained, both at the same time. And I also think that there's something about the immigrant experience, at least one of the conclusions I come to is there's something about being a daughter of immigrants. So I was an immigrant myself, that made me open to opportunities in a different way.
Mm,
So also I had a couple of working titles before this one, Tap Dancing on Everest. One of them was Unguided,
mm.
because I felt a little unguided as a child. And because my parents were busy building new lives, and then we were unguided on the mountains, so that had the double entendre. I also had Less Wise as a potential title, and that's based on a quote in our book, and if any of you know of the famous Everest explorer George Mallory, he actually, the 100th anniversary of his disappearance is happening right now, this
Oh,
month or
wow.
last month. Yeah, 1924 to now. So anyway, they had they had attempted the north face of Everest in Tibet, but when they saw the east face, which was our side of the mountain, George Mallory said, other men, less wise, might attempt this way if they would, but emphatically it was not for us. The East and Less Wise has double entendres. A memoir is all about gaining wisdom, and then, but um, that was the thing about why our team became historic, is that the East Face had only been climbed once before us, big team using oxygen, and even to this day has been summited by around 15 people compared to over like 11,000 on all the other routes of Everest. So it's a
Wow.
very steep, avalanche-ridden side of the mountain, very remote and hard to get to, and 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 that was, something else about our trip.
And would you agree that it's less wise?
Yes, a lot of people would agree, which is why they haven't, I don't think anyone's been there in a couple decades. Like
Wow.
they're not even, yeah, trying to go there. Um, but of course, then we all had this adventure of a lifetime, so I, I'm of course glad I was there.
So you mentioned the possible other titles. Explain what this title means, Tap Dancing on Everest.
Yeah, so this one also most people think is just a metaphor, and yet it's actually a concrete scene where I did tap dance on Everest because I brought my tap shoes with me. My dream had been to be a Broadway dancer. And now I wasn't brave enough to do that, which is why I think about the risks, this whole idea of what risks are we willing to take? Because then it was just a few years later that I backpacked alone in Nepal. Um, but dance is a through line through the book, because one of the other contrasts I make is, this feeling of being kind of confined in my childhood, in my experiences, um, and then the expansiveness of nature and glacier and mountains, and dance, represents freedom to me, and so that's where the title came from.
And you even have a picture of it, I think.
Well, I'm not in tap shoes on the cover. I'm in my mountain boots, but I am dancing.
Right. I have to say, the thought of carrying everything on my back and choosing to include tap shoes, that was a bold choice.
I don't know why I had those or the tie-dye tights I'm wearing on the cover, but I did chalk it up to being 25.
Um, so I mentioned the Dayenu scene, and there's a lot of Jewish elements in this story. From your own family background and your education to time in Israel to ways that you sort of wove Jewish observance into some of your time when you were in Nepal. Talk about how you kind of brought the Jewish themes in and where some of those appear.
Yeah, so that's another one of the surprising things, is as I was writing and as the family appeared in the writing, it became really important to me to make this a Jewish story, because that's so much a part of my identity. And I do feel that's underrepresented in Everest books.
For sure.
And, and Jewish woman adventurers and explorers. I really wanted that to be there. And I wanted, and as I'm coming of age and searching for who I am, Judaism is a part of that, right? I was sent to Orthodox Jewish schools, camps. My family was not observant, so there was a conflict there. At some point, I choose to become Orthodox on my own, influenced by school when I was about 11 for a couple of years. And so, the mountains are also a very spiritual place for me. So, Judaism, spirituality, there's some Buddhism. To me, that's all kind of that search for identity. But I was sort of looking for where Judaism fit in the book, you know, um, well to include it between my parents and my own kind of search for identity.
Mhm. Do you want to share with us a piece from the Passover scene
Yeah.
in the hall?
So you had mentioned Dayenu, and Passover itself recurs a couple of times throughout the book. Um, and when I am on the Everest expedition, I do host a Seder on the, again, it's spontaneous. I see the full moon and host a Seder. But this is earlier in the book. This is when I'm trekking in Nepal. And I'll read a short excerpt of what happened there. Dropping my backpack in front of the tea house in Bulbulay, I spotted a couple moving on, not stopping where the guidebook advised. I was looking forward to putting my feet up and cracking open a book, but they inspired me to keep going. I hoisted up my pack, threw it on my sweaty back, and followed them. A short while later, they stopped and spread out their sleeping bags. I did the same about 20 yards away, beside a 200-foot waterfall, under a crown of bright light from a full moon. A massive tropical tree stood rooted beside the falls, and the moon reminded me that today was the first night of Passover, the holiday commemorating the Jews' escape from enslavement in Egypt and subsequent wandering in the desert. Lying in my sleeping bag, feeling the cold wind on my cheeks, and hearing the branches creak, I realized I was wandering like my ancestors, not knowing what each day would bring. I was walking toward freedom as they had, freedom from my shoulds. And at the same time, I was firmly rooted in my origins, like the massive tree beside me. I'm going to skip a part about, it talks about when I was Orthodox. And then I say, I missed the peace and comfort that had come from my practice of orthodoxy, from thinking God was always with me and always cared about me. I wasn't alone. Yet here, alone at the waterfall, steeped in these thoughts, I didn't feel lonely. I lay on my back, searching the sky flooded by brightness, pondering this Passover night full of hope, wonder, and curiosity. This night was indeed different from all other nights, the phrase that anchors the Passover Seder. This night engendered a sense of home and peace, attached to no deity, leaving me rested, tired, and fulfilled in the shadow of the mountains that had been there for millions of years and would continue to stand for millions more.
Mm, beautiful. And such a different vision of Passover than such a, usually so home based with all of the things that come along with that, both in terms of other people, but also in terms of all of the, the things that weigh us down, which you didn't have with you in terms of, you know, not just all the cleaning and stuff that you have to do, but even just the kind of heirlooms and the kind of accretion of family traditions and materials that come, and the idea of celebrating it in a way that is free of that is really interesting. Although I also kept thinking, if you went now, I bet there would be um a lot of Israelis traveling and probably a lot of seders happening on treks now.
That's true, probably was. But I also loved, because it happens here and then it happens in Tibet, the idea I wasn't so, conscious of what date it was on a calendar, but like the way that holidays were intended to be, to look up the moon and know it's the night of the holiday. I love that.
Right.
And then later on the mountain in Tibet, it's a very different scene, but we're in down parkas, and it's my way of sharing my Judaism with all my teammates who are not Jewish,
Mm-hmm.
and bringing that sense of home.
And you also write in that scene about how open your teammates were to it, in part because ritual became so important when you were just kind of out in this vastness and waiting, and the time had a different meaning, and there was kind of this need to create things that would kind of root you in different ways. And so even people for whom Passover didn't have any meaning, there was kind of excitement around being able to participate in a ritual together.
Yeah, it's true. And I think of myself as, you know, being kind of in the background, and it was like a moment of stepping up and, really sharing myself with these guys, because a lot of the book has that feeling of being the only woman and not relating to a lot of what's going on with them. And yeah, so that moment just really meant a lot to me. And yeah, they ate it up.
Mm.
So,
Um, I loved those aspects where you were kind of trying to figure out what the feminist journey was and all of this as well. And some of it, I think, it felt you mentioned that question of sort of constraint and vastness, and there's kind of this theme also that you explore in the book around taking up space, and learning to take up space, but also doing that in this, like, as you're also recognizing your smallness in this kind of vast space. But some of it also is about being the only woman and sort of needing to prove yourself in certain ways. How conscious were you of that at the time? And is it something that, like, did your perspective on that change looking back at all?
I was very conscious of the only woman aspect of it because it frustrated me a lot. And I think why I wrote so much in my journal was it was like a friend to talk to, because I think as women we process so much by talking.
Mhm.
And I couldn't. The guys just they really wanted to talk about every climb they had ever been on, and and things like that. It was just, and that really bonded them. They really needed to do that because they were taking on this like extraordinary mountain.
Right.
Um, the hiding and coming into my own, I think I can see more now with perspective. I, it's comfortable for me to be in the background of just personality wise. And I think that first trek in Nepal was just really life changing because I had only myself to rely on. I had to make all my decisions with no noise, no world noise, no family noise. And, it sounds cliche, but it really let me step into my own. And yeah, so it's all sort of a continuum of feeling that ability, desire, and then success at claiming my feet and taking up that space.
Hmm. Um, right. And it's such a physical challenge also, beyond just the the challenge of being on your own. And that part seemed, I kind of blew my mind.
Yeah, so in all the ways I think that I was pretty insecure about things. And that's also why I wanted to write the book, because it wasn't like I was this super confident person. I was going to do everything and be great at it. But it was more that I questioned myself all the time, and yet I did it. And I think that that's more relatable to most people. I think that we now, especially that I'm older, I realize that, most people have those questions about themselves. And that's what I kind of hope readers get out of this is it's okay to question ourselves and still go forward with the fear, you know. Um, and the physical part, the body is almost like an extra character in the book from the very, I frame that from the second chapter on. Um, and, the body required to do these things. I see myself, well, part of why, the subtitle is A Young Doctor's Unlikely Adventure. But I also am, my character is framed as an unlikely person to go on this sort of experience. Um, I can tell you a little more of it. So when we first introduced my mother, she is dressing to go to work and she's putting on her girdle, and I'm around third grade. Um, and the girdle represents that confinement. I said there's like the issue of confinement to expansiveness. Um, and my body, I was born premature, put in an incubator, that whole box theme. And then my legs as an infant were put in full casts. My grandmother put me in dance because she had been a dancer in Berlin and she had to flee the Nazis. So that's another way that dance comes in. Um, but when I'm talking about my mother in the girdle, it's also a way to introduce that our family was all overweight. And this is before the body positivity movement. So as a chubby child, I felt a lot of shame about my body. And um, and also I bring up that my father, who I mentioned was a Holocaust survivor, had been a slave laborer in Siberia and almost starved to death. And I question, what is that connection? Him starving, us overeating, um, psychologic, epigenetic, and it's sort of, what I say at the end of that chapter, if I can find it, is our bodies defining us, composing us, clenching memories within our casings of skin, sometimes trussed in girdles. Our bodies, our first consciousness. My body, so much a part of my story. My body, my mat. Because it was my body then that became strong in dance and then in hiking that really led me. And when I could let my body lead, and if I could get out of my head,
Hmm.
those were the moments of strength.
Although, of course, also as the medical expert, you had to be bringing that piece as well. And, sort of how to balance those two things seems like it's tricky.
Yeah, and I mean that's the other way that the theme of body is so important, because I my curiosity about bodies led me to medicine, and here I was tasked with taking care of the bodies of others, a skill I had to learn and grow into, a situation that terrified me. I'm responsible for these people on a mountain where there's no chance of rescue. Um, and Just another important aspect of the body.
Yeah. And as I think and I know some other people I've talked about this in the past, sometimes on other talks we've done, my own scholarly work is about women's health and the relationship between politics and embodiment. So I loved how much the body was present and sort of navigating what it is to be in a body and to try to work within that body. And then also when you need to kind of transcend the limits of the body in some ways, and how that's possible and when that's possible. And I thought it was also really interesting in terms of some of your experience as a woman, sort of that you talk, you write about some of the challenges of just dealing with your period on the trail, and like, how do you change a tampon when you're in snow up to your knees? And what if you have to pee in the middle of the night, and the men can pee in a bottle in the tent and you had to go outside, or had to figure out eventually how to pee into a bottle in a tent, and just sort of the things that are the unexpected things that you had to figure out that were not a given in the experience of trekking.
Yeah, and I felt like because I'm a doctor and an OBGYN, I wanted to be really open about that aspect of being a woman in this circumstance. There was a day where we were trekking somewhere out of the way. I won't go into all the details, where at first they didn't want me to come along. They thought I would slow things down, and that infuriated me. And I went along, and you know, I didn't slow them down, but I was behind them, seeing them. And yeah, at that moment, I had to change my tampon. And, I write about that. For me, that was one of my most empowering memories of the entire trip, because I just felt like, look at you guys. You don't even know what I'm dealing with, but I'm dealing with it, and I'm keeping up with you. And so take that.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure a lot of people can. Again, I would never have thought I could say I relate to something that has to do with an Everest climb, but that I definitely, definitely can relate to.
Yeah. But I
Um,
really wanted to be open about all the bodily function things, but, mostly from the physician perspective, just to normalize that.
yeah, absolutely. And because it is something that, especially if we want women to be able to be in these spaces, then you have to share sort of what that experience is, and ways that people work it out and kind of make it more visible. We have a couple of questions in the chat about sort of how you as somebody who, Emily asks, how you as somebody who didn't have a lot of mountaineering experience ended up being able to go on this climb.
Yeah. So when I was hiking in Nepal for a few months, I got very strong. And when I met the Everest climbers, they had been on the mountain, which deconditions them. So they were kind of weak. So, I appeared like someone who was really good in mountains. Um, and, I question them a lot. Can't you get a real doctor who's good in the mountains? And, but now I realize, maybe not. Not everyone does well at high altitude. And I just happen to do well at high altitude. So I studied the medical um, things required. I wasn't experienced, but I did, I tried to rise to that occasion and take on the role. But that's why, because I was hiking, and um, appeared fit.
And I will brag on your behalf that towards the end of the book, when some surgeons come along and help out in a really stressful time when you were dealing with a lot of the injuries that the climbers came down with and were sort of uncertain about whether you were handling it right, they were so when they finally came and helped out and took a look, they were so impressed with your work that one of them offered you a spot in his residency on the spot.
Yeah, that was interesting. um, but yeah, I mean, I did, my entire third year of medical school, I studied every night and every weekend extra, all the mountaineering medicine. Again, that doesn't mean I was experienced, but I at least collected as much knowledge as I could
Yeah.
to fill that role. Now I also realize that a lot of small mountaineering teams don't have a medical person. They may not even have that. So I think that, at the time I didn't realize that. I was, you know, how am I going to do this? But I think that's why they were okay, with it.
Mm-hmm. I think also it sounds to me like you fit into the mode that I think we often see, which is that when people feel, you know, less confident about our abilities, we might over prepare. You sound like an over preparer. And
Yeah.
and you probably were sort of, you know, competent in a way that I could imagine a lot of people who might be attracted to going on these kinds of things and be sort of more blustery might not have been.
No, that's very true. Yes, I prepared a lot. And then even while I was on the mountain, in a lot of the downtime, I read my medical books, I read my notes. I was quizzing myself all the time on the sorts of emergencies that would happen and then that we had. So yes, I was preparing for a lot of the time.
We have a question from Diana about whether, given how much you enjoyed it, you might have considered becoming a doctor who did this kind of work professionally. Did you have that thought at all before you returned to your original OBGYN plan?
I was a little tempted. Right when I got back, I was invited on some other expeditions, but I had gone into medicine specifically to become an OBGYN. So it wasn't even that I wanted medicine so much, but I had this strong feminist drive to take care of women. Um, so I was tempted, and I think that I would have enjoyed that a lot, but then, given up something else, which was, this desire to work with women and be a voice for women.
So speaking about that, I mentioned in the introduction that in addition to this memoir, you've also written a play, The Post-Row Monologues. Tell us a little bit about that project.
Yeah, so I handed my manuscript into my agent, and then I thought, well, maybe I'll never write another thing again. And then a month later, Dobbs happened. And I was in an advocacy meeting, actually, National Council of Jewish Women, and we were discussing how we were going to educate the community about this Supreme Court decision. And I got this idea, like out of thin air, to write a play. I interviewed some people from to create some different characters, but and did some research, but then also just relied on my lifelong career taking care of women in these circumstances. And yeah, I thought it would just be a one night event in Atlanta to educate the community. We had a great response. And so the play, to use theater language, had some legs after that. So it's had a couple of other performances. But I found, it's sort of like I love JWA because it's all about elevating the stories of women. And I found this kind of new passion with like writing my own story, really hoping that it empowers other women. And then writing the play to really reach people on a more emotional level with these stories that we read in the news. But when a character is embodying it, it just reaches you on a different level.
Did it feel like a very different kind of writing?
Very different. Yeah. First of all, fiction was a nice change.
Right.
It's,
You don't have
it's
to grill yourself quite as much.
yeah, memoir is really tough, um, because it has to be all true. um, that was freeing, and yeah, and then a play is all dialogue, so that was different. I liked it. It was good, But again, just doing that was scary, and like, who am I to write a play, or who am I to write a book? Like, all of the same vulnerabilities, insecurities that I was writing about getting me to Everest, I was sort of reliving in all these years with these
Mm,
new projects. And yet I truly believe that's how we grow, and I believe that if we have a voice kind of an idea pops into your head, it's kind of fun to follow it and
yeah.
and test yourself out a little bit.
I think sometimes one of the things that maybe we hope from these kinds of stories of something very brave and adventurous, part of the appeal is that you sort of hope that in achieving that thing, that it quells that inner voice, that inner critic, um and of course no. So yes, you were able to, be on this Everest climb, and that's an incredible achievement. And obviously, it built your confidence in certain ways. But right, as you're saying, that's just part of the human process is feeling those feelings, and then you have to kind of reconquer them in each setting. But I sometimes feel like as you were saying that, I was like, of course that's true. And there's also part of me that's like, oh, right, of course. Even climbing Mount Everest does not mean that then you're like, and all of my insecurities have now been vanquished.
It's true. I wish. It's funny when you start to talk about memoir and you take a lot of classes and they say, well, memoir has to be about a transformation. Okay, what does transformation mean? And I was really fighting against the idea that that happens. All of a sudden, you're like,
Right.
well, I started here and now I'm here and I'm great. No, life isn't like that. It's a continuous, growth process if you want to continue to grow.
Right. And I think there's good metaphors for that in your book also of like all the times that you have to like try a trail and then switch back and sort of it's not it would be nice to think that there's always this map and it's clear, but that's actually not how growth happens. It's not linear in that way and it's not mapped out for you and it involves a lot of, wrong turns or whatever other ways we could carry this metaphor on, but I think that
Yeah,
that works there as well.
that's where I started the book where I did because it was I worried so much about caring for the climbers, and then I wasn't really anticipating they'd be missing and possibly gone, and that was just so much to deal with. That was an experience that really shifted something inside, like facing that uncertainty, because we face that every day. So
Mhm.
I do think like flexing that muscle of getting to your rock bottom with that kind of uncertainty builds something in you.
Right. And just the sort of practicing of taking risks, which obviously this is a very extreme risk. Um, but also, as you're saying, we sort of have these mini experiences all the time of choosing to do something unexpected or putting ourselves in an unfamiliar situation and believing that we can do the thing we've set out to do.
Yeah, like even should I stay in this job or should I leave this job? Like there are choices like that every day that everyone faces. It doesn't have to be a mountain. And you know, it's comfortable to stay where we are, or do we take a risk? That new thing is really an unknown, and sometimes we have to push ourselves to do that risk, especially if there's a reason where we're sort of being called to it to bring that idea back,
Right.
or a curiosity or a passion, a real dream or something.
So obviously climbing Everest is super risky. And part of the story is you recognizing actually how risky that is. And you recently wrote an article for Salon called Mount Everest was the riskiest place I'd practiced medicine until I became an OBGYN in the South. So tell us a little bit about the difference between those two risky experiences and how you're experiencing your work now in that framework.
Yeah, well, what I write in that essay is that um, we fully chose the risk to go to Everest. A lot of people will think that's a bad idea. But we as individuals went through a process of deciding this was right for us and took a risk. Being an OBGYN in the South, have laws imposed on me that I have to practice under that put my patients at risk that I have no say in.
Mm.
And it's back to that feeling of being confined, being very worried about my patients, um, and um, frustrated, resentful. Obviously, I don't believe the state should be involved in medical decisions. And we trained to take the best care of our patients that we can through a framework of evidence-based medicine. And this is like hamstringing us. So it's frustrating.
Yeah. That that the idea that it's such a different experience of you have all this expertise now and you aren't able to use it as opposed to feeling like you were in a situation where you were kind of trying to build up your expertise for what was required.
Yeah, it's really true. But I could do anything there, and there's so much I can't do here.
Mhm.
And this is what, 36 years later. It's hard to comprehend.
Yeah, and it's part of that nonlinear ways that change happens. But your work also contributes to not only continuing to take care of women under these difficult circumstances, but the for example, your play is part of how we push back against the kinds of changes that have happened.
Yeah, and I believe that we'll we'll get our rights back at some point, but a lot of people are suffering along the way and during the process. I do believe strongly in using my voice, so that I get, my father, who was the Holocaust survivor, instilled that in me. He had been enslaved in Siberia, I mentioned, so he was so thankful for democracy. And really inspires my social action.
Mhm. We have a kind of OBGYN sort of medical question about what you attribute the high rate of maternal mortality in the US to.
It's really a systems problem. A lot of it, I think, has to do with poor access to medical care, not listening to women when they have certain complaints, um, not being, we were talking about being, very compulsive or being a cowboy. No, you need to listen to women and be very compulsive about following up on complaints. Um, we have a very diverse society. Many people, are low income and don't have great access, and they are the ones suffering the highest maternal mortality. Black women have the highest maternal mortality. So there's definitely systemic issues involved. And unfortunately, the states with the highest mortality are also the ones restricting abortion. And abortion is so much safer than carrying a pregnancy. So it's really unethical, in my opinion, to force a woman to carry a pregnancy to term that increases her chance of mortality, versus having a safe, legal early abortion.
Right. And for people who are interested in some of these questions, we did a book talk. Um, at this point, I think it was probably in 2020 with Javi Karkowski, who is a high risk OBGYN who wrote a memoir about her work in that field. So I encourage you to check out on our book talks page. You should be able to find the recording of that for more information on that, her experiences doing that kind of work. I want to go back to your book for as we wrap up, Mimi. And so you, except for a brief epilogue that kind of catches us up a little bit on some of what happens post climb, you end your story with the descent from the mountain. And I'm curious how, what the re-entry process was like and how you brought these kinds of like big lessons of Everest home with you back to your kind of more normal life in medical school.
Yeah, so I had a lot of mixed emotions when I returned. I sort of had this, question. I just went through this dream, like this big dream. What comes next, Um, so that was one thing that I was processing. And on the other hand, I was really, really grateful for all of the modern amenities we have. I write in the book, I was grateful for ceilings and electricity and phones. Um, so I think that has kind of stuck with me. I've done some work in Africa, contraceptive work, and, you know, was so surprised that it's a bare room. When we go into a medical exam room, it's full of stuff, papers, gadgets, and there it's still bare. So the contrast of that, stuck with me. Um, and and then I really just, medical school was kind of all absorbing. So on the other hand, there wasn't much time to think much more about that. And then career, family, children. I was lucky enough to find, a wonderful husband and have three children who are wonderful. And, so
Life is full.
I've had a pretty, suburban life, ironically.
Did you ever go back to Nepal or have you yet, or would you?
I would totally 100% go back to Nepal and Tibet. I would love to. I really wanted our team to go back together. We get together every once in a while. It was such a small team. Um, we had a great 25th year reunion in London at the Royal Geographical Society. And then the guys came together for a Zoom for my book launch, which was so nice.
That's so sweet.
So I'd love to go back with them, back to the Kangshung phase. I don't know if it'll ever happen.
Well, I know you love to travel, but it is a big world. There's much to see.
Yes.
What's your next writing project?
I really don't have one. So unless inspiration strikes, it's been an occasional essay, but I don't have a big project.
That's okay. No pressure. We're excited for whatever comes next.
Thank you.
We have a question about what I didn't even know that you recorded the audiobook version yourself, but we have a question from someone who listened to the audiobook. What was that like?
That was unusual. Um, it was very intimate. I have thought about writing about this because it was I'm in this kind of darkish room with a lot of padding. And then on a video, the engineer is in another room and she's in my headphones and she's kind of reacting to my story sometimes.
Hmm.
And, we're spending this 2.5 days together in this really dark kind of one-to-one conversation. Um, so it was a really fun experience. I wish I could have learned more, like practiced and that sort of thing. It was just kind of a wing it sort of thing, and without like many opportunities to do over things. So I haven't listened to it. I don't think I ever will.
It's hard to listen to yourself. I feel that
Yeah,
way whenever I'm on our podcast. I'm like, oh God, I can't listen to it.
exactly, exactly.
What have responses to your book been like?
It's been so heartening to have something so personal. First of all, it's terrifying to have something so personal out there. But when if someone starts to talk to me and I think about and I see how they've processed the material and made it their own. So that's the thing about memoir. Sometimes people think, oh, memoir, it's just you being narcissistic writing your story, but it's really not. It's about you wanting to convey something to a reader and hoping they get that. And so when a reader says, like, I love this part or I related to this part, it's like the most heartening thing that this thing that you attempted to do actually worked, or for that person, or, you know, um, and because there are so many different sort of aspects, people relate to different things. And it's exactly what I had hoped would happen. So it's really a beautiful experience.
Well, it's a beautiful book. So thank you for writing it and for sharing it with us and for reminding us to, take on those challenges that we might not feel quite ready for. And I hope that there will be a whole new generation of women climbers and doctors and others who are really inspired by your book. And it's just exciting to be able to read this story, which is as you said at the beginning, it's such an unusual one. There aren't a lot of stories out there like this. So I highly recommend it for anyone who hasn't read it yet. And thank you for being with us tonight and for sharing this with us.
Thank you so much, Judith. I really, really, really appreciate it. And thank you.
Well, it's been wonderful to be in conversation, and I want to share with everyone else that there's also always more to learn at JWA. I love to share things that are relevant that are in the rest of our collection. There is a Jewish woman who organized the first all-female ascent of Annapurna in Nepal in 1978. Her name is Arlene. Is it Blum or Bloom? Do you know? I've never known.
I just spent time with her and I didn't ask her if it's Blum or Bloom.
So Arlene Blum or Bloom, but we have a little piece about her on our site. Also, in our encyclopedia, you can learn about women's health activism in the US and about pioneering Jewish OBGYN Bessie Moses. You can listen to an oral history with Dr. Ruth Finkelstein, an OBGYN who worked in Bessie Moses's Bureau for Contraceptive Advice in Baltimore. We'll also, I think we already dropped into the chat, the link to Mimi's recent article in Salon that I mentioned, and the link to sign up for her newsletter, which gives medical news along with inspiration from art and nature and is a lot of fun. There is no book talk next Thursday because it will be Shavuot, but we'll be back the following week, Thursday, June 20th, same time, same place, for a conversation with Rebecca Claren on her book, The Cost of Free Land, Jews, Lakota, and an American Inheritance. And if you're looking for some learning on Shavuot, JWA is a co-sponsor of the Tikkun Zoom Shavuot organized by Temple Israel in Boston. And I actually will be teaching a session Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Time called Speaking Up for Social Change, Learning from Our Foremothers and Daughters. And until next time, take care, everybody. Have a happy Shavuot, Chag Sameach, and wonderful to be together. And
Thank you.
thank you again, Mimi. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.